Hello and welcome to Prime Time. My name is Camilla Macpherson. I'm Head of Secretariat for Prime Finance. I'm going to start today's session on getting beyond Libor with some housekeeping. The session is being recorded and will be distributed later. Attendees are muted and have their video switched off. If you have a question or comment, we'd love to hear from you. Please use the Q&A function to get in touch. In the meantime, we'll be using the chat function to contact you. If you're asking a question, it can be helpful to include your name and affiliation. I'd like to thank FTI Consulting, McCann Fitzgerald and Travis Smith for sponsoring this series of Prime Time, and LexisNexis for their help with promotion. Let me now introduce Joanna Perkins, who is moderating today's session. Joanna works as a consultant specializing in financial services regulation and regulatory affairs. Until recently, she was Chief Executive of the Financial Markets Law Committee, and in fact was at the head of the FMLC Secretariat for more than 16 years. She previously served as a non-executive director of ICE Benchmark Administration Limited and chairperson for the Oversight Committee of ICE Libor. She's also practiced as a barrister at South Square, focusing on financial transactions, and she's a prime finance expert. Joanna, let me hand over to you to introduce the rest of today's panel.
Thank you, Camilla, and thank you to Prime and the Prime Secretariat. I have the pleasure of welcoming you all to Prime Time Presents Getting Beyond Libor and introducing our fabulous panel today. Replacing Libor is a challenge on many fronts. I think we all know that, the volume and diversity of contracts that reference Libor, the difficulty of engineering a transition without bringing about a wealth transfer, and questions of contractual continuity. To address these challenges and more, we are lucky to have today a preeminent panel of commentators, Tom Baxter, Darrell Duffie, and Franck Risler. They are all three Prime experts. Tom Baxter is now a sole practitioner in his own name. Previously, he was of counsel at Sullivan Cromwell LLP, and before that, a former general counsel and executive vice president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Actually, I might have got that wrong. I don't know about the order. Apologies, Tom. Tom focuses on advising clients in financial services on areas of including governance, payment issues, and regulatory affairs. He has special expertise in dealing with central banks around the world. That's going to be very useful to us today. Professor Darrell Duffie is Adams Distinguished Professor of Management and Professor of Finance at Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. He's a fellow of the Econometric Society, a research fellow of the National Bureau of Economic Research, fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, independent member of the Board of Dimensional Funds, and a member of the Systemic Risk Council. Franck Risler is Senior Managing Director at FTI Consulting and leader of the Securities, Commodities, and Derivatives practice there. He is a member of FTI's Consulting Libor Transition Task Force and a former hedge fund manager and sell-side derivatives trader. I am about to embark on a series of questions for the panel because this will be an interactive session. At the end, we very much hope that there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. Please do so through the Q&A function, and I will ask the questions that you raise there. If you can give a name and affiliation, so much the better. Thank you. So the last 6 months have seen a lot of activity in the regulatory space focused on Libor transition. I'm just going to recap those developments very briefly to set the scene. In February, amendments to the EU benchmarks regulation were published in the official journal of the EU. And these give the European Commission the power to mandate the use of a designated replacement rate for continued rates that are systemically important, like Libor. Then in March, the FCA confirmed the Libor end date for all currencies except 5 of 7 USD tenors. and that end date is the 31st of December 21. The remaining USD tenors will cease in 2023. In April, New York enacted legislation to the problem of tough legacy USD LIBOR contracts. And in May, the governor of the Bank of England gave a speech focusing on LIBOR transition and spoke out strongly against credit-sensitive rates as substitutes for sterling LIBOR. Also in May, the UK Financial Services Act, which makes provision for LIBOR transition in various ways, received the royal assent. And to bring us up to date, earlier this month, the FSB produced a roadmap for transition and in the process issued a number of statements, including an expression of support for ISDA's spread adjustments for transitioning cash products, and it gave a nod to there being a potential role for term rates in transition. I'm about to turn to the problem of tough legacy and legislation, but Tom, you've been involved with the ARRC. Is there anything you'd like to add to that timetable that I just set out?
No, Joanna, I think that you set out the timetable very well. The three things that I would highlight in terms of developments over the last 3 months are, first, the one that you flagged, and that is the announcement in March by ICE Benchmark Administration and the FCA of the schedule for a transition away from LIBOR. And I know we were all expecting that schedule, but the announcements themselves, I think, really drove home the point that this is really happening. And it's going to happen with respect to 4 currencies at the end of the year and with respect to the $5 LIBOR tenors 18 months thereafter. So that I would say is a key development. Second is the regulatory developments. And I just want to focus on what's happened on the regulatory front, because I don't think it gets the attention it deserves. We started in March of this year with announcements by the federal financial regulators in the United States, the OCC, the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, that LIBOR should no longer be used, and that's dollar LIBOR, after the end of this year, so December 30th of this year. That was repeated, that guidance, by the FSB in early June. June 2nd is the date. And then only last week, on Thursday, we had another announcement which came from the European Commission, the European Central Bank in its supervisory capacity, and also ESMA and the European Banking Authority, which again repeated the regulatory guidance. That is, you should not be placing customers into LIBOR referenced instruments after the end of this year, but earlier than that if you can and it's practicable. So the supervisory guidance over the last 6 months has been something that I don't think gets appropriate attention. And then the final key development, and you covered this in a broad brush, Joanna, are the legislative developments in New York, certainly in the EU, and also in the UK. And I know we're going to touch on those with respect to the tough legacy instrument problem. And just to frame that for the oncoming discussion, we can think of a tough legacy instrument as an instrument that's referenced to LIBOR, but that does not have any fallback language or appropriate fallback language. So that when we get to the secession date, let's assume it's the end of this year, we'll have an instrument referenced to LIBOR where LIBOR is no longer published. And so the problem with a tough legacy instrument is it's an instrument with a void in it. And when we talk about the legislation, we'll talk about possible ways that the legislation can fill that void. So with that as background, let me stop.
Thank you, Tom. That just gives me a beautiful segue. So I'm going to take full advantage of it. Our first question will indeed be about legislation. And as you said, one reason why legislation is needed is the perception that it will bolster contractual continuity, particularly for legacy contracts. In March, the ARRC said in a progress report that USD LIBOR contracts outstanding are now about 223 trillion US dollars. That has gone up since 3 years ago, which is perhaps a surprising result. And of these, it estimates that about $90 trillion worth will remain outstanding when dollar LIBOR comes to an end. So the question of legacy contracts is not a trivial or negligible one. Earlier this year, the FCA produced a consultation on tough legacy and identified 3 or 4 characteristics of tough legacy contracts, including the one that you mentioned as the primary one, that they don't contain fallbacks. It also mentioned contracts which have no liquidity around in markets which have no liquidity around alternative benchmarks, contracts which are difficult to amend because of the number of parties or the ease of identifying them, and contracts with retail borrowers or other parties who are passive in the contract as to terms and conditions ordinarily. Frank, before I ask in detail about the legislation, I know you and I have discussed a couple of the situations that we think will exemplify tough legacy. Do you want to touch on any of the products that we referenced the other day? I think you might be muted.
Yes, sorry, Joanna. Yeah, I think it's very interesting to put a heat map on really where are the more problematic area. I mean, first of all, in general, we can say that the derivative market is in good shape, on good track, and that's probably the bulk of the notional. Now, other area, like for the cash market, which seems to be more the more problematic area, things like commercial loan and credit facility with a small number of lenders, and that you were touching on that. The greater the number of parties, very often the more difficult it is. So commercial loan, credit facility, small number of lenders, and if you have an agent that administers this thing, in general, that's easier to amend. So very often the issue comes where a bond or securitization, and essentially it's because they're widely held. And for instance, for securitization, there are really fallback conditions which are which either don't work or are not executable. And a very famous one is the pooling mechanism. The derivative market looked at it and rejected it as an unpractical mechanism. So this one is really problematic. And then the fallback of the pooling mechanism is the last LIBOR. And the last LIBOR obviously is an extreme one because it affected the value, it's creating winner and loser, and it changed the risk profile. So that's actually a very good illustration of a particular product or particular type of product that have fallback, but that will create obviously a lot of issues due to a lot of unintended consequences.
Thank you. So turning to the legislation, measures are now enacted in 3 jurisdictions, if I can call the EU a jurisdiction. So that's the UK, the EU, and New York. And they've taken very different approaches. The EU regulation allows the Commission to designate a replacement rate for discontinued third country benchmarks that will automatically be incorporated into MiFID instruments and EU governed contracts between EU parties. A late stage amendment carved out the situation where a benchmark is subject to an orderly wind down in its home jurisdiction. So I think that may cover the FCA, may cover the LIBOR situation. And it was a late stage amendment, which was incorporated because of issues that were raised by the markets. More recently, the UK Act allows the FCA to designate a benchmark as unrepresentative, to prohibit use of that benchmark in new contracts, and to make provision to prescribe a methodology for legacy use. So with those 2 proposals, or indeed now measures on the table, returning to you, Tom, would you like to say a bit about the New York situation?
Yes, Joanna, thank you very much. I'll start out with New York, and I'll touch briefly on what's happened in the UK and the EU as well. And I think that a couple of preliminary statements are appropriate. First, the legislation is an attempt to facilitate transition. No one listening to this recording or to this session should believe that legislation is a cure to LIBOR transition. You have to do the work and think about the legislation as ancillary, as helping with the transition. So that's the first comment I'd make across the board with respect to all of the legislation. And one way to approach this is to inquire how the legislation might facilitate transition with respect to your currency and your instrument. And in some cases, it may facilitate, in other cases, it may not. So let's start with New York, and let's start with the simple example of a tough legacy instrument, an instrument that referenced dollar LIBOR, but dollar LIBOR has gone away, and we no longer have a reference rate in our instrument. One question is, does that mean we don't have to pay the instrument, that we've had a frustration of contract and we can walk away from the obligation to pay principal and interest because the contract has been frustrated? The New York legislation, for example, would answer that question in the negative and say, if the legislation applies, because we have an instrument that's referenced to dollar LIBOR and that has a governing law clause that adopts New York as the governing law, that in those circumstances, you can't just walk away from the contract. The legislation would also help transition from LIBOR in that it would fill the void. And in New York, what the legislation would do is it would look to the appropriate recommending body, which would be the Federal Reserve, or alternatively, the ARC, which was mentioned by Joanna, and is a group sponsored by the Fed to help with LIBOR transition, that the rate recommended by that body would be, by legislation, inserted into our instrument with a void. And that's likely to be, and we know this from all of the various ARC pronouncements over the last couple of years, that rate is likely to be SOFR plus a spread adjustment. So the utility of the New York legislation is that it eliminates what we might consider to be defenses that shouldn't be honorable, like I don't have to pay because the interest rate has gone away. And it fills the void by adopting the reference rate that has been recommended by either the Fed or the ARC. So that's an illustration of how New York law can help with the transition away from LIBOR. The English solution is a little bit different. And I look at this as a solution that'll take us to the same destination, but through a little different route. And the route that you see in the English law changes is a route that creates the prospect of something called synthetic LIBOR. And what synthetic LIBOR will be is it will look like LIBOR looks right now on a screen. So if you look at Bloomberg, you'll see a number. That number will be characterized as LIBOR, but it'll be produced using a different methodology. And the methodology will be prescribed by the Financial Conduct Authority, which will tell the benchmark administrator, ICE benchmark administration, that you should publish LIBOR after the cessation date, but publish it using a different methodology. And that methodology would be essentially a risk-free rate plus a spread adjustment. So in the case of dollar LIBOR, the English version of the legislative solution would look to say what the ARC has produced, SOFR plus a spread adjustment. And it would say to, and this is hypothetical, say to the benchmark administrator, publish that rate as dollar LIBOR. The benchmark administrator would do that, and on a screen, you'd see a LIBOR number, but it would be a number generated through a different methodology. And so we'd be able to fill the void in an instrument using the number that appears on the screen, and that number will be the product of the new powers conferred on the FCA to require the benchmark administrator to publish a synthetic version of a LIBOR number. So that's a very, very generalized description of what the UK legislation does. With respect to the EU, it is, as Joanna described it, the European Commission can select the new rate and would likely do so for whatever LIBOR currency it is by taking close guidance from the risk-free working group in the country that is affected. So in the case of dollar LIBOR, it's likely the EU would look again to what is being proposed by either the ARC or the Fed as the replacement rate for dollar LIBOR, and that would become the rate that the EC would adopt for dollar LIBOR within the EU. Now, again, all of this is a very general description of what is much more complex legislation, but it's all to underscore one of the points that I think is important, in that the legislation is bringing us to a common destination, and that is to deal with tough legacy problems by coming up with a replacement rate that the parties themselves had not contemplated. In addition, come back to my point that I began with, this is to facilitate transition. It's not to replace the hard work that everyone needs to do to make the transition as smooth as possible. So that's the existing legislation. The good news for everyone is there's more coming. We have proposed federal legislation in the United States, and there will likely be additional English legislation dealing with safe harbors. And with that, I'll stop.
Thanks. Darrell, I know you have strong views because you've expressed them on some of these legislative measures, but actually I want to pick your brains on something that's even closer to your heart. One thing that a lot of market participants would think would minimize the need for all this legislative intervention is an attractive credit-sensitive term rate to replace LIBOR. What is the prospect of one being available and quite high and underpinning a market getting established? And what are the costs and benefits of that?
Surely, Joanna, and thank you for inviting me today. So on the credit-sensitive add-on to SOFR or credit-sensitive rate, actually the prospects are numerous. We have more than one, we have several. There's one called Ameribor. There's a strong new entrant this year from Bloomberg called BISB, which looks a lot like LIBOR in some respects. The ICE benchmark administrators have a bank yield index that's a substitute, proposed substitute for LIBOR. SOFR Academy is pushing forward a rate spread called AXI, which actually I had did some academic work on some time ago. There are a number of proposals, and I haven't listed all of them. The concern, of course, is that will they be fit for purpose, not only for bank lending, and I'm sure they'll be okay for bank lending, but also for a broader range of applications. And one might say, well, they don't need to be used for other applications, but of course, once you have a very popular credit-sensitive index for bank lending, there will be plenty of applications involving derivatives. That's in fact how LIBOR came into the derivatives world in the first place. Going back to the 1980s, it was used initially for bank lending, but then it was realized how popular it could be in the world of derivatives, and the swaps market was built on LIBOR as a consequence. Because, for example, corporations and banks want to swap from floating to fixed, and they need a swap market to do that. So if a credit-sensitive rate were to become popular for bank lending, chances are it would also become popular in the derivatives markets, and that will put regulators, at least in the United States, possibly in a somewhat tenuous situation. And this actually brings us back to Tom's very crystal clear description of the legislation and your question about legislation. The United States stands out as a jurisdiction that does not have legislation regarding what's a fit for purpose benchmark. So as Tom mentioned, bank supervisors have said after 2021, there shall be no new LIBOR products. But other than their general supervisory authority, they can't really, or at least not initially, rule out other credit-sensitive rates that may or may not be fit for purpose once they're heavily used. So my view is perhaps when it comes to federal legislation, Congress might consider giving bank regulators a bit more say on what's a fit for purpose benchmark. Not that they would necessarily use it, but that if the market understood that regulators had this extra cudgel as a backstop, then maybe they wouldn't jump into a credit sensitive rate that's not ready for a broad and heavy use in the derivatives markets. I do think, by the way, that credit sensitive rates have a natural role in bank lending. I'm working on this as a research topic, and many regional banks in the United States have said, we think that a credit sensitive rate or add-on to SOFR would be useful, and I tend to agree with them. And now we get to the, as I said, the more difficult issue of how broad a use can a credit sensitive rate support, given that at least for 90-day credit spreads, there aren't a whole lot of transactions upon which to build a credit sensitive rate. That's why we are here today, because it's actually not that easy to fix LIBOR with the small set of transactions. It's I think not a problem for bank lending, but it might be a problem for heavy use in the derivatives markets.
Great. Yes. So I was just smiling because I was remembering how strongly the governor of the Bank of England came out against credit-sensitive rates last month. But if we, and perhaps we can come back to that, but what I really would think would be interesting to hear from the panel on are the risks of transitions. Franck, you are our designated market participant representative here today. So let's start with you. What do you see as the key risks of LIBOR transition for the markets?
Well, there are quite a few. I think right now what is quite interesting is understanding uncertainty and about exactly what the transition will be. Obviously, the uncertainty had been reduced. We had a pre-secession trigger. We have, as we said, I mean, the derivative market is a bulk of the transition. There is a certain clarity, not for everything, but the simpler product, the swap product, the linear product, we have a good understanding of what's likely to happen. The contingent product, swaption, and so on. And then there's probably a need of an established SOFR volatility market, and we'll get to that when we talk about the term SOFR, which I think you wanted to discuss. But I think there's still an uncertainty, and I don't know if you want me to speak quickly about the term SOFR, if it's the right time, Joanna, or?
Yes, please do. Please do.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing is there are certain pieces of the transition depending for which product you're looking at, where the kind of essential piece is not available yet. So derivative market seems to be in a good shape, and then for the bulk of it and certain products, there are things where liquidity needs to establish in the volatility market and certain more structured products. But there is a roadmap, there is an understanding, and I think the derivative market has a good experience in adapting to a lot of things. Now, for the cash market, what's very interesting, and I think it's a very nice transition to what Darrell was just discussing, people hear all the time, well, Libor is an unsecure forward-looking term rate, and SOFR is a risk-free overnight rate. So Darrell covered very eloquently the kind of insecure versus risk-free. Now we have the term rate versus the overnight. And the very interesting thing is, for a lot of cash products, the kind of regulatory approved fallback leaves the term SOFR on top of a waterfall. So we have a waterfall where you have a term SOFR that doesn't exist yet. And we'll go to the kind of step. There is an understanding of what it could be, and it's starting to be clearer and clearer, but it doesn't exist yet. And then there are alternatives, and the alternative is compounding in arrear and so on, which, again, the derivative market understands very well, but for certain area of the cash market, some market participants find it a little bit more challenging. So, again, talking about the derivative market, the construction of a term rate from an overnight rate is something market participants have been quite accustomed. There is a discounting based on, there used to be a discounting based on Fed fund rate for a little while, and the market of OIS, which was very established. So it's pretty clear we could have a framework of building a term rate very, very similar to the OIS market. So that's not a surprise. And people are very sanguine and comfortable with that. Now, the ERC actually came with a clear roadmap and a clear understanding of what could happen. And there are a few steps. So the first step was really the establishment of the initial buildup of the infrastructure and the initial liquidity building. And the time frame was around 2018, 2019. It started to happen. Then the second step was the transition of the main clearinghouse for the large derivative trade, which was essentially the swap trade, namely LCS, London Clearinghouse, and CME, to transition to a discounting from Fed fund rate to SOFR. So that actually was nicknamed a big bang, but it's obviously something that was creating, it's an incentive for further liquidity in a term SOFR. That happened actually in October 2020. So to give the audience a note of magnitude, for LCH, it was over 1 million contract and about 120 trillion notional. So that was actually a very significant step. To your point, Joanna, a lot of things happened recently. You still have uncertainty, but a lot of things happened recently in terms of term rate. So the ERC came in May 6th and identified basically the step that needs to happen for them to recommend a term SOFR rate, which again comes on top of the waterfall for a lot of cash products. And that's what they call the market condition, their market indicator. We're going to get to that in a second. Just after that, they announced the appointment of CME as an administrator. So we're almost at the end where we could see a term SOFR existing, but it's not quite there. So an administrator, an independent administrator has been appointed. There are criteria, but now the final step in order for ERC to be able to recommend a term SOFR is a satisfaction of their market indicator. And the market indicator are quite interesting actually, because there is really this kind of more holistic view of really a big buildup in the liquidity and materiality of the SOFR ecosystem. So of course, that's actually conditioned on the overnight SOFR link liquidity, which will be equivalent to the OIS market. That's what we're talking for the Fed fund rate. So now you have SOFR futures on the CME, you have SOFR swaps and so on. The liquidity of a SOFR future on the CME in Q1 was around 232 billion. And obviously CME having been selected, the idea is that the methodology to build up a curve will incorporate not only futures but swaps. So that's significant progress has been made towards this thing. But the other condition of the ERC is not only to look at that, but to look actually at the swap market, which obviously will transition from Libor to SOFR, to make sure that it's actually really embracing SOFR. So they're making condition on the execution, the market making. They want electronic market making of SOFR products. They want basically the reference and the default product to be SOFR swap, no longer Libor swap. And they're making condition on actually a swaption market on SOFR, a cap market, so derivative and volatility product on SOFR, which is quite interesting. And the last one is condition on the establishment of a cash market referencing SOFR. So to finish on term SOFR, it's quite interesting because we've been through a build-up of a market in SOFR derivative. We've been through a big event where the discounting now is in SOFR for the two largest clearinghouse. We've been on the appointment of an administrator, which was actually late May. Just before that, the ARC told us exactly what are the criteria that they're looking, and now we're just waiting for the final step is those criteria to be satisfied. And those criteria really look at a broad set of conditions, which are not only the liquidity of the overnight SOFR-linked derivative, which will be the one was supporting initially the buildup of a curve using the derivative market, but really the swap market, the swaption market, and the cash market as well. So really having a very robust market to avoid basically the pitfall of why Libor is being replaced. So to get back to the risk of the transition, I think there are few risks. I think one of them, which is being often mentioned, Tom spoke very eloquently about the tough legacy and so on. So I think we covered this thing. I think for various actors, one of the issues is probably an outstanding uncertainty of exactly what's going to happen, whether you will have the ability of credit sensitive, whether you're going to have the ability of a term SOFR and so on. I think as we advance through time and the transition is approaching, this uncertainty is reducing, but there are still an element of uncertainty.
Thank you. Yes, Frank. So I'm glad you mentioned term SOFR because there really is a plethora of credible plans out there for alternative rates. Darrell, is one of the risks that we all face fragmentation, just everybody going off in a different direction? What do you think?
Well, if it were to happen, it would be a negative because it would make it more difficult to comparison shop when you're trying to get a loan. And it would just raise costs in terms of market depth and liquidity. Research shows that more transparency into a single benchmark improves market quality and provides better deals for customers of banks. However, in the end, I don't think it's going to turn out to happen because history shows, and rightfully so, that there are huge positive externalities to joining whichever benchmark turns out to be the most popular for the reasons that I described. And that's how, again, Libor became the vast machine that it became. Once liquidity is established in a benchmark like Libor, everybody wants to go to it. I hope that benchmark is SOFR so that we get depth and liquidity in a market that's safe for all applications. There could also be liquidity and some credit spread add-on to SOFR. In the end, while there may be a number of entrants to that market, I don't think more than one perhaps will take the lion's share of the market, and the rest will take very small shares because of this liquidity begetting liquidity effect. So I'm not that concerned about that risk. I think the bigger concerns are, well, will there be enough legislation to cover legacy, and will market participants be ready by the end of the year? Their operational progress is not as fast as it should be. And then finally, if a credit sensitive rate were to become very, very dominant in the market for both cash and derivatives products, would that be a concern for financial stability? I think those are the main risks.
Tom, I see two predominant risks on the legal side, but I'm sure you'll tell me I've got it wrong. But the two risks that I see are conflict of laws and the possibility of disputes, litigation around wealth transfers. What do you see ahead on the legal side?
So, so I agree with you, Joanna, that disputes is certainly one area where there are going to be significant risks. And let me talk to the potential for disputes, because one source of those disputes is conflict. And let's take up a possible conflict that's been identified in one of the questions we've received. And that is, suppose that when it comes time for synthetic Libor in the UK, and let's suppose it's 3-month dollar Libor, which will go away on June 30th of 2023. And let's hypothesize that what the UK decides is to produce a synthetic version of 3-month dollar Libor, and to produce that version using SOFR plus a term SOFR. Let's assume that term SOFR is then available. It's not available right now. And let's further assume that in New York, the ARC has continued to adhere to overnight SOFR. And so we have the potential for a conflict there between what the UK has done in the synthetic version of dollar Libor and what New York has done by adopting the recommendation of the ARC, and that's the overnight version. So that's an illustration of one potential type of conflict that will change the value. And it's the change in value that produces winners and losers. And at least in my experience, winners and losers tend to be situations that result in dispute. And then there's a need to resolve those disputes. So there's that. Let's also talk a little bit about the prospect for credit sensitive rates. And here I thought Darrell did a really nice job in summarizing the state of play. And Joanna, you made the point that Governor Bailey has expressed some skepticism toward credit sensitive rates. But we've learned recently that Governor Bailey is not alone in the official sector. He was joined by Gary Gensler, the chair of the SEC, in some very public remarks that were not kind to credit sensitive rates. And Secretary Yellen as well, in her remarks to the FSOC in June, was also somewhat skeptical of credit sensitive rates, and both alluded to some of the problems of Libor in the past, the ability to manipulate Libor, and also the sufficiency of transactions that support Libor rates. So you know, there again, there's, I think, a hefty skepticism in the official sector toward credit sensitive rates. Last point on disputes, and I think it's an important point. We tend to assume that when our instrument has a fallback rate, that all is fine. But if you start to look at the language of some of those alternative reference rates that are the subject of the fallback provision, they're not so fine. There's a whole history of disputes involving the use of prime. So if our instrument falls back to prime, that's not necessarily a great situation with respect to the prospect of winners and losers and the prospect of disputes concerning the alternative reference rate that is specified in the instrument. So again, that's a nice example because that instrument would not be covered by the New York legislation, but notwithstanding that, that type of fallback could certainly result in disputes. Final point, and then I'll stop with respect to risk management. One of the really helpful aspects of today's environment is we are in a very low interest rate environment now. I started my career at the Fed in 1980, and the overnight rate on repo at the time was about 12.5%. And that just illustrates for you that in an environment like that, a transition away from Libor could produce all kinds of havoc. But in a very low interest rate environment, it's probably the ideal time for a transition. And I realize now I'm probably treading a little bit on Darrell's expertise. He is a renowned expert in this area. But it seems to me that we ought to also acknowledge the helpful interest rate environment that exists at the time of this transition. Thank you.
Well, I wish I could give Darrell a right of reply, but I've been told to move on to the questions. And so perhaps he'll squeeze that in by hook or by crook. I'm going to, if the other question askers will forgive me, I'm going to start with a question from John Schachter, just because he says he's got to go. So that's prime for you, responsive panels, responsive moderators. Hi, bit of a tight schedule for me here, but he wanted to ask whether the auto sales market might be a model for the plethora of alternatives, because, sorry, I just got to scroll up there. There's no majority market share. The plurality is with General Motors, but 3 other companies have significant shares. And would that be healthy competition, I think, is the question. Clearly, it's a model that works for the automotive industry or for the consumers of automotives. Would it work in a benchmark situation? I think, Darrell, you started to sketch out a reason why that might not be ideal. But would you want to develop that, and then I'll go to Frank?
Yeah, I do want to respond to Mr. Schachter's question. It's an excellent one. So there is scope for competition here. It should be that market innovation will produce competition towards the best result. So for example, there are 4 or 5 different alternatives for credit sensitive rates. That it's good that there's competing alternatives, because not all of them are going to be equally good. The issue is once the market becomes familiar with these, it's going to start to tilt a little bit towards a preferred credit sensitive rate. And once the writing is on the wall about which that is, I predict there will be a general movement towards that one, because everyone wants to have a contract that's easy to hedge in deep markets, that's very transparent and comparable across different financial services firms that are providing contracts in a credit sensitive rate. And so there will be what economists call positive externalities or network externalities will build up towards, as I said, one of them having a relatively dominant market share. How big that share is remains to be determined, though. Perhaps SOFR will be so dominant that it won't be necessary to use credit sensitive rates, that the benefit of having everybody on the same rate will dominate the hedging, the preferred hedging options available to banks when they have access to a credit sensitive rate. So it remains to be seen, but I don't expect the automobile manufacturing market to be a good analogy to the case for benchmarks.
Thanks. It's related in my mind to Jeff Golden's question, which is about linked contracts. This was very much an issue as the EU legislation was making its way through due process, because it was being achieved through amendments to the BMR, the benchmarks regulation, which did not cover certain kinds of loans, which were therefore not in scope. So there was a risk that this new fallback would, or this new replacement rate would be implied into derivative contracts, but not into loans in short, which obviously can be linked. Franck, can I take the question very briefly? Would you like to make a couple of observations on fragmentation and perhaps linked contracts from the perspective of a market participant?
No, sure, of course. I think, well, first of all, I fully agree with what Darrell just explained. I mean, it's always good to have a lot of liquidity. And the interesting thing, I mean, the observation that he made before in his remark on credit sensitive is the derivative market doesn't exist on its own. The derivative market is here to hedge. And it's always a very interesting thing because now we have a path for the derivative market, and the fact that we have the fallback protocol and everything seems to be happy to compound in area. But obviously, if the loan market takes a very different path, then obviously the derivative market will need to adjust because the derivative market is a hedging market essentially. So it's very, very, very important to really have a view of the ecosystem. So we want a lot of liquidity because it will reduce cost and so on. If we have fragmentation, what we're going to create is a lot of basis swap market and so on. So just to try to bridge it, and having in mind the fact that actually the more we can harmonize this market, the more we're going to improve the hedge effectiveness.
Thank you, Tom. We have Jeff's question on linked contracts, and we also have one about where the new New York legislation will point to which rate in the Q&A. What do you think? Should more be done legislatively to make sure that linked contracts don't end up referring to different rates? Is that a particular problem for tough legacy?
So I don't see that as a particular problem. It's certainly one that we're going to have to face. My own view is that once we get over the continuity of contract, that we have an adequate replacement rate for Libor, that those issues will all follow along. So I don't see that as a significant problem. I do think that the conflict problem is a real one, although the official sector, I think, understands well that if there is conflict between these various laws and how they work, that will itself become a financial stability event. And so at least it's my sense that the official sector will work exceptionally hard to assure that that does not result. So, you know, with respect to the FCA, for example, I find it very hard to believe that the FCA would adopt term SOFR if the ARC was in a different place, particularly with creating a synthetic version of dollar Libor. So I see that as a remote prospect because the official sector understands the problem and will not put themselves in that jeopardy. So again, I think that's solvable. What's less solvable are the instruments that aren't the subject of legislation and that have provisions that are in the nature of fallback provisions that just don't work, or were drafted by people and at a time when they may have worked but no longer work. That's a whole different set of problems. It's a set of problems that isn't addressed by legislation. And again, it brings us back to the point about preparedness, that we need to do the inventory, we need to know what the instruments are, we need to see the problems before cessation date, and we need to work through those problems to resolve them. When we last had this P.R.I.M.E conference, I gave out a piece of advice, and that is that counterparties should be working with each other to amend language that's problematic. I know there is a view that some don't want to be the first mover because they believe being the first mover makes you look weak. I think that is just wrong. And you want to be ready. And if that means being the first mover, then be the first mover. It's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign you know what you're doing.
Darrell, we're coming up on the end of our session now, but I just wonder if you can very quickly say a couple of words on what I take to be Benny Giajona's point, which is that we really need a rate that's going to work for predictive modeling when we set out on our transactions.
Well, from the beginning, the idea of compounding in arrears has struck some market participants as a strange new place to be, where they don't know at the beginning of an interest rate period what their interest payment will be at the end of the period. And it strikes them as operationally problematic for some. I actually think that it's a question that's resolved just by getting used to it. It's not that hard to predict what your interest payment will be. And as you get towards the end of the quarter, if it's a quarterly payment, you will know with increasing certainty as the end of the quarter approaches what your interest payment will be, and you will have the dollar number to the penny well in time to make the payment. So I think it's a question of really lack of familiarity and also some operational aspects, because your back office has to be operationally rewired to handle that. But I think it's a transition thing rather than an ongoing concern. I think once market participants are familiar with this payment in arrears approach, it's not going to be a problem. It's just going to be a normal course of business interest payment. Quotations will not be a problem. I don't really see much of an issue except just getting used to it and getting operationally ready.
And that means that that's the last question we have time for. I'm going to take Pierre de Ravel d'Escaplan's question myself. He asks whether the disputes that will arise will lend themselves to mediation as opposed to adjudication. I think I see that Tom is nodding there. I think preeminently financial disputes do lend themselves to mediation. The whole point about money is that we ought to be able to compromise because it's fungible and it's not all those things we care. We have red lines over like family and such like, so a reputation and so forth. So my own view is that these disputes will lend themselves to mediation, and I'm sorry if it wasn't my view you were looking for, Pierre, but we are, as I say, out of time. So it remains for me to thank these preeminent panelists and for their extraordinary contribution. I've learned a lot, and also to thank the attendees for being here today and giving up their time and asking interesting questions. This is series 4 of Prime Time. Upcoming sessions will cover carbon trading, choice of law, and a conversation with World Bank General Counsel Sandy Okoro. If you are interested in sponsoring an event, please get in touch with Camilla. And I'm here to thank FTI Consulting, McCann Fitzgerald, and Travis Smith for sponsoring the series. Also to Lexis for their support. Prime Finance accepts donations through Friends of Prime to support its work. If you would like to make a donation or to find out more, please contact the Secretariat through Camilla using the details in the chat box. Camilla, did I catch it all?
That was perfect, Joanna. That was everything. Thank you so much.
Well, I'll hand over to you then to say goodbye to the audience.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for dialing in, and thank you again to all of our speakers. And we look forward to seeing you all again in the audience for our next session.
And thank you, Joanna, for being
Thank you very much,
moderator.
Thanks, Joanna and Camilla, both.
Thank you,
really
Joanna.
Wonderful session. Thanks, Tom and Franck.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Tom and Joanna. Have a good day. Bye.